We all think we know how far we should hit each iron, but what is the truth? Well, I've got all the data to analyse how far you should be hitting each iron. So in this video, we can take a look at how far each handicap index hits each iron in their bag on average. This is a median carry distance, and this data has come from Arccos. So it's nearly 1 billion real-life shots from real golfers on real golf courses. So this should give you a really good idea of where you stack up in your handicap index, right? So let's start with 0 to 5 handicaps. So the median distance for each iron in the bag for 0 to 5 index handicappers looks a little something like this. So we'll start with the 4 iron, and that average carry is 187 yards, 5 iron 172.9, 6 iron 163.9, 7 iron 154, which I think some people might think is a little short for a 0 to 5 index handicap, and we're going to get a lot of that as this video goes on, that I think the numbers are smaller than what we thought. 8 iron 144.6, 9 iron 133.6, and finally the pitching wedge 119.2. Now, as we go through each index, I'm going to talk about the biggest gap in the bag for each index from this median data from Arccos. And interestingly, for a 0 to 5 handicapper, that biggest gap becomes between the 4 and the 5 iron, with a 14.1 yard difference. That's the biggest, which to me at least shows really consistent gapping through the bag. That 14-yard gap is the biggest one. That's probably why they're a 0 to 5 index handicapper. That strike is consistent and that gapping is therefore consistent as well. So that's something interesting to look at. And again, I think we're used to seeing tour pros hit their 7 irons 180 plus yards and therefore think low handicap golfers do the same. This shows they don't. That 7 iron averaging that median distance of 154, I think quite a lot of people might hit that who aren't in that handicap index. So it's an interesting stat and one to look out for as we work through the handicap indexes. Okay, so I'm stood 147 yards away from the pin behind me, and that incidentally is the exact median carry distance a 5 to 10 handicap index golfer hits their 7 iron. So I'll bring up the graph now to show you the rest of the distances for this handicap index. So 5 to 10 index, their 4 iron will carry 175.9 yards, 5 iron 163.9, 6 iron 157 exactly, 7 iron 147.3, so not quite 147 like I just said, 8 iron 139.2, 9 iron 128.4, and finally that pitching wedge goes 113.7 yards. Now remember, these are average distances, so I know you might think they're a little bit smaller, but you know that is taking everything into account from a huge set of golfers, by the way. Interestingly, biggest gap in the bag for the 5 to 10 index is at the other side of the bag from the 0 to 5. So the biggest gap is between 9 iron and pitching wedge, which is 14.7 yards, which is a little bit more than a club, you'd say. And it's an interesting one. I think a lot of golfers who sit in this range might want to figure out, because these are scoring clubs, and having a big gap between your 9 and your pitching wedge might cost you a couple of greens hit across a round. One to note and one to make a note of as you go through the rest of the indexes. Now I fall into this category range. I'm a 6.5 index. So if I bring up my Arccos app now, I'll show you a little screen recording of my distances. I'm actually a little bit above the average, and I'm not just showing off there, I just thought I'd bring it up. But my 7 iron average is 156. Now, I've used this app for 3 years now, logged all my shots since I've been using it. So this is really accurate for how far I hit all my clubs, obviously very useful. And you can also see that my gapping between my pitching wedge and 9 iron corresponds as well. That's actually 16 yards, so a little bit more than the average, but one I need to work on, and whether that's changing lofts or working on striking my pitching wedge better, I don't know what it is. But this all computes as well from my Arccos data, as well as the generic data for 5 to 10 indexes. Right, next up, I'm stood 141 yards away from that pin behind me, which is the average median carry distance for a 7 iron for 10 to 15 index golfers. Let's get the graph up now and look at the rest of those stats. This index golfer's 4 iron goes 167.1 yards, 5 iron 156.5, 6 iron 150.5, 7 iron 141.4 to be precise, 8 iron 134.3, 9 iron 124 exactly, and pitching wedge 108.2 yards. And again, like the 5 to 10 index golfer, that biggest gap in the bag of all the irons is between the pitching wedge and the 9 iron. This time it's 15.8 yards, which again is like a club and a half sort of distance here, which is really an interesting thing that came up as we did this research alongside Arccos. And compared to a 0 to 5 index golfer, these 10 to 15 are pretty much a club shorter in terms of distance. So I guess if you sit in this range and you play with a low single figure golfer, when they pull out an 8 iron, you'll be putting out a 7-iron on average to compete with that distance. Right, I've moved up the hole again. We're now 135 yards away from that pin, which is the average carry distance for a 7-iron for a 15 to 20 index golfer. Now, considering the average handicap, I think at least in the UK, is 17, this should be relevant to most of you watching now. So let's bring up the data again for you to visualize and look at the rest of the clubs. So 4-iron carry, 156.6, 5-iron, 148.1, 6-iron, 143.9. There's that 7-iron, 135 exactly on average. 8-iron, 129. 9-iron, 118.6, and pitching wedge, 101.6. Now, again, the eagle-eyed amongst you will see the biggest gapping in there is, again, for these 15 to 20 index golfers, between the pitching wedge and the 9-iron, and it's gone even further this time. It's now 17 yards between those two clubs. I don't know why that is. Let me know down in the comments why you think the gapping there is so much larger. But when you go further up the bag and you see the gap in between like 5-iron and 4-iron, for example, at 156 and 148 is like 8 yards. And then all of a sudden there's a 17-yard gap between the bottom of the bag. Something's going on there. Let me know in the comments what you think that is. But those are the average distances for what I would consider at least to be the average golfer. Okay, last handicap index we're going to look at in this video, 2025 golfers. I've come to 128 yards out, and that is the average distance those golfers will be hitting their 7-iron. Let's look at the rest of the data again. I'll bring up all this pretty imagery for you. Their 4-iron will go 146.9 yards on average, 5-iron 140.5, 6-iron 137.5, 7-iron 128.9, 8-iron 123.8, 9-iron 113.1, and lastly, the pitching wedge, 94.6 yards. And shock horror, again, it's a trend we've seen, but the biggest gap in the bag for 20 to 25 index golfers is that 9 to pitching wedge. And this time it's eked out even further, 18.5 yards. Again, let me know why you think that's the case. I think realistically, obviously, the ball becomes harder to strike the less loft there is on the irons, right? So you can see that 4-iron, 5-iron, 6-iron all going a very similar distance, but that starts to spread out as there's a bit more loft on the club and they start to strike the ball a little better. That's my theory anyway. But as we've seen for each index, as it gets a little, higher, that gap between the wedge and the 9-iron gets bigger, and those top-end clubs just kind of squeeze into one similar-ish number. But really interesting, no doubt. And lastly, on these index golfers, that 0 to 5 handicap golfer we saw, averaging their 8-iron of 144, that's about a 4-iron for this kind of golfer. So there's a 4-club difference between that 0 to 5 index golfer and that 20 to 25 index golfer. Now, before we wrap this video, I'm going to head to the green and I'm going to briefly talk about green and regulation percentages. Fun stuff. Okay, so to round this video off, I've come to the green to chat about green and regulation percentage by handicap, by distance as well. So Arccos will put this data together for us to see how often you should be hitting a green from what distance, depending on your handicap, right? All sounds very complex, it isn't. I'm gonna bring up a graph now, take a look at it, pause if you need to digest it a little bit more. But I wanted to look at 2 specific parts of this, which was the 100 to 124 yards and the percentages. So a 0 handicap scratch golfer from that distance will hit the green just a little under 70% of the time. Bearing in mind they're probably hitting a pitching wedge or a gap wedge in from here. That's obviously impressive, but they also miss 3 and 10 from that range. So food for thought when you get a bit angry about yourself for missing a green from not that far away. The best golfers, they do it as well. For you 20 handicap golfer, so just a little bit above what the average handicap is, 40% of the time. So again, not a lot, but that's probably because they're coming in with, as we saw, more loft in their hand, like an 8 or a 7-iron for their average distance, right? So it's a little bit harder to control. So food for thought there about sort of how often you're hitting a green from what doesn't feel like a long way out. If you go to the other end of this graph and look at 200 plus yards, again, never kick yourself for missing a green from that far away. It doesn't happen very often. Look at the 0 index golfer hitting it less than 20% of the time, and that 20 handicapper sort of doing it occasionally, a couple of percent. I wouldn't worry about it too much. But again, from all the distances there, from that brilliant graph, you can get a really good idea of how often you should be hitting the green from what distance. So we spoke about distance earlier and how far you should be hitting each club, but obviously proximity to this thing, the flag and the hole, is very important as well. And just having a knowledge of that, I think, can feed good information to the mind when you're out on the golf course, right? So thanks again for Arccos, putting like brilliant data together, and let me know down in the comments, where do you sit within your handicap index? Are you a little bit above it like I am, which I'm very excited about obviously because distance is cool. Are you about average, are you a little bit below? Let me know where you sit, and if you were surprised by any of the numbers, because I certainly was, and let me know about that 9-iron pitching wedge gap thing. I don't know what's going on there. If you've got any ideas, let me know, I'd love to hear about it. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.